Come right on in. Welcome, everybody. All right, I will begin after everyone is admitted. Okay. Good afternoon and welcome everyone to the first Friday lecture for the month of December. Today's speaker is Adam Rose, and Adam's title is Great Books and Big Lies, Theirs and Ours. Please note that this presentation is being recorded and it will be available on the Graham School YouTube channel if you want to watch it later. Also, please be aware that you will not be able to unmute your microphones during this presentation as a courtesy to our speaker. You will be able to ask questions in the chat box. I will keep track of, you can do so at any time during the presentation. Questions that you type in the chat box, I will keep track of, and then I will pose them to Adam at the end of the lecture during the question and answer period. During the presentation itself, as I say, all will be muted except for our speaker. Adam and I will be able to see your video, but we won't be able to hear you. So if you choose to leave your video on or to turn it off, it is at your discretion. Adam's video will be spotlighted for the most part during the presentation. Consequently, the best way to view the lecture is to select speaker view instead of gallery view. Today's lecture is being sponsored by the basic program of liberal education for adults at the University of Chicago's Graham School. My name is Kendall Sharp, and I am the Cyril O'Hoole Chair of the basic program. Before I properly introduce our speaker, I'd like to say a few words about the basic program, the Graham School, and our upcoming courses and events. The basic program is a 4-year certificate program at the University of Chicago's Graham School of Continuing Studies. Graham offers an array of programs besides the basic program. Since 1946, we have offered our students a rigorous liberal arts curriculum based on the principle that there is no substitute for direct engagement with big ideas in their original texts. Through focused discussion, our classes provide direct encounters with some of the great works of classical and Western culture in a dedicated community of adult learners led by experienced University of Chicago educated instructors. Most of our classes still take place remotely, although this year we are offering a small number of courses in person downtown. Registration for winter courses is underway, so you can learn more about our courses on our website. Our next First Friday lecture will happen on January 6th, and the speaker will be me, Kendall Sharp. My title will be Reading for Freedom and Equality in the basic program curriculum. The First Friday lecture series will continue monthly throughout the academic year. Tonight, we have another installment of our successful series of basic program movie nights. Tonight's discussion will begin at 6 p.m. The movie we've watched in advance is Memento. Basic program student Jay Miller and alum, I may add, has spearheaded this movie night. Thanks, Jay. I'm looking forward to tonight. The Graham School invites you to join us for a special gathering and book drive aimed at celebrating the spirit of the holidays. On December 15 from 5 to 7 p.m., we will host the Graham Holiday Gathering at the Gleacher Center. This event is both an opportunity to hear Graham instructors and community partners discuss our efforts to expand access to lifelong learning, as well as a holiday reception where you can mingle and reflect on the year with your fellow lifelong learners. To make this event accessible to the whole Graham community, the panel discussion will be live streamed via Zoom. If you can join us in person or online, please RSVP at the website on screen to secure your spot. We would also like to make you aware of an initiative running through mid-December, the first ever Graham School Book Drive. This holiday season, Graham is partnering with UChicago's My Very Own Library to collect gently used books to share with community partners and schools to expand access to lifelong liberal education. Books will be collected at the Graham Holiday Gathering and on the concourse level of the Gleacher Center through mid-December. As I mentioned before, this presentation is being recorded. The recording will be available to current and former students on the Graham School YouTube channel early next week. Now, let me introduce our speaker. Adam Rose did his graduate work with the Committee on General Studies in the Humanities and the Committee on Human Development at the University of Chicago. He is primarily interested in exploring the ways in which the production and reception of texts of all types affect human life, especially the ways in which texts shape people's views about themselves and the world they live in. Although this often means working with scriptures such as the Hebrew Bible, New Testament, and the Quran, this interest has also led him to apply the same approach to great works of literature such as Homer's Odyssey, Tolstoy's War and Peace, and Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter. Adam has taught in the basic program since 1993. He is a former staff chair and recipient of the 2007 Graham School Excellence in Teaching Award. Now, it is my pleasure to turn things over to Adam. I will stop my share. There we are. I want to spotlight Adam. There you are. We good?
No.
Looks good.
You can see me?
Yep. Blast off.
Okay. So, hello, everybody. Glad to see you, I guess, or glad for you to be able to see me. It's a pleasure to be here to do this First Friday lecture. This lecture is a bit different than some of the lectures I've done in the past. Often, usually when I give these talks, I've got a particular book in mind that I try to interpret or put in some kind of historical context or explain. This lecture is geared more towards current events rather than an old book. And in some weird way might end up turning out to be a kind of infomercial for the basic program, which I guess is not really a bad thing, but I'm doing it in terms of current events. But because it is about current events, parts of it may be controversial. And so I'm glad not only is everybody muted that you can't ask questions, you can't throw stones through the internet. So at least there's one good thing about that. I also should say that everything I'm going to say today is, of course, only my own personal opinion. It's not the opinion of the program, any of my colleagues, the University of Chicago, or anybody else. So the description for today's lecture said that in contrast to Plato's ideal polity ruled by a philosopher-king, an ideal democracy must be ruled by philosopher-citizens, each of whom pursues wisdom through independent critical thinking. One of the central ongoing tasks of such free thinking is the recognition, analysis, and rebuttal of the assorted quote-unquote big lies, which is another word for propaganda, that is perpetually perpetrated by foe and friend alike. Lifelong liberal education grounded in the great books can help us do this. As the preface to an old University of Chicago reader once put it, if citizens are to be free, they must be their own judges. If they are to judge well, they must be wise. Citizens may be born free, but they are not born wise. Therefore, the business of liberal education in a democracy is to make free men, free people, wise. And that's what I'd kind of like to talk with you about today. And so there's a kind of basic problem behind today's talk, which is really kind of simple, but not easy, which is that good thinking is hard. Really, good thinking is hard to do. Francis Bacon, for example, once talked about the four idols that made thinking difficult. He called it the idols of the tribe, of the cave, of the marketplace, of the theater. There's lots of different things that can get in the way between each one of us and something that might approach the truth. And so when we're dealing with things like propaganda or so-called big lies, we're dealing with these kinds of things that are not just kind of accidentally in the environment to make good thinking difficult, but things that are kind of put out in the environment intentionally to make good thinking difficult. So I want to look at some of these things, and I've got some examples. The examples I've picked are partly historical, partly contemporary events. I could have picked others. I'm not meaning to impose my particular politics on anybody. So if you don't like the particular example I got, would come up with another one with your favorite bête noire, because I really think that what we're dealing with here is a kind of more general phenomenon than any of the particular examples that I'm going to be talking about. And so this concept of the big lie, it's been in the news a lot lately. It's usually associated with the Nazis. The term was originally coined by Hitler, and it's this idea of some kind of gross distortion or misrepresentative of the truth that is so large that it really kind of puts the population into some kind of like parallel universe. It's not a little lie. It's not a little falsehood. And so there's a famous statement. It's often attributed to Joseph Goebbels, who apparently didn't really say this, but it expresses the idea behind this notion of the big lie. And the idea is that if you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it. The lie can be maintained only for such time as the state can shield the people from the political, economic, and/or military consequences of the lie. It thus becomes vitally important for the state to use all of its powers to repress dissent. For truth is the mortal enemy of the lie, and thus by extension, the truth is the greatest enemy of the state. Now, as I say, this apparently wasn't really said by Goebbels, but we can take it whether this is putting forward some kind of sense of what this concept is about. And the reason I subtitled my lecture, Theirs and Ours, is because they're really, this concept of the big lie is most often used to attack whoever our enemy is. I mean, if we're on the side of truth and light, then the enemy, whoever they may be, it could be the Nazis, could be the Soviets, could be the whoever it is, they are the perpetrators of the big lie. And we, of course, are the knights in shining armor who stand for truth, justice, and the American way, to coin a TV show. So certainly that's something that we find out in the world. So for example, in today's environment, a lot of people would say, for example, that this is RT's website, rt.com. This is short for Russia Today. It's put out by the Russians. This would, for many people, would be considered, quote unquote, propaganda, or that everything that they're putting out is participating in this big lie. Or we can also have a kind of domestic version of, them. I mean, obviously, we probably have people with lots of different politics in today's meeting. But, if you happen to be kind of like one of the so-called, like, the good liberal folks, Democrats, blue party, blue state person, then there's something about Donald Trump and the big lie. Okay. On the other hand, if you happen to be a Republican, red state, red person, something like that, maybe you don't think of that as a big lie, because that's your side of the thing. But so it's very easy to smear or tar whoever your adversary is, whether it's a foreign or domestic adversary, as being a purveyor of propaganda, of being the purveyor of the big lie. But it's also, it's a universal phenomenon. It's not limited to just evil people. In Machiavelli's The Prince, in chapter 18, Machiavelli has one of, I think, literally one of the most apt statements that applies to this phenomenon. And Machiavelli says, in a little bit antique language, Machiavelli says, "For men universally judge more by the eye than by the hands, because it is given to everyone that they see, but to few that they can touch. Everyone sees what you seem to be, but few touch what you are. And those few will not dare to oppose themselves to the opinion of the many, who have the majesty of the state defending them. and with respect to all human actions, and especially those of princes, where there is no judge to whom to appeal, one looks to the end. Let a prince then win and maintain the state, the means will always be judged honorable and will be praised by everyone. And here's the money quote. For the vulgar are always taken in by the appearance and the outcome of a thing. And in this world, there is no one but the vulgar. And that means you and me, folks, right? That the way the world works according to Machiavelli is that human beings, as part of the human condition, really, are almost always taken in by the appearance of things. And of course, that goes into a lot of the, Machiavelli's approach to politics and political science about maintaining a certain kind of facade, regardless of, or maybe not even regardless, especially in contradistinction to what's actually getting done underneath. So this concept of the big lie or of propaganda, I think is part and parcel of this notion that comes from, was articulated by Machiavelli here about the appearance of things, and that in this world there is no one but the vulgar, and that means us. Now, a slightly more modern formulation of this from Carl Sagan, and one of the nice things about working with older people is that you remember the same stuff I do, hopefully. So hopefully I don't have to explain who Carl Sagan was. If I just say billions and billions of stars, you'll kind of get the whole point. But Carl Sagan had this, talked about this in terms of bamboozling. And it wasn't really about politics in particular, but it was again about this idea of good thinking and being able to get to the truth. And Sagan said, one of the saddest lessons of history is this: if we've been bamboozled long enough, we tend to reject any evidence of the bamboozle. We're no longer interested in finding out the truth. The bamboozle has captured us. It's simply too painful to acknowledge, even to ourselves, that we've been taken. Once you give a charlatan power over you, you almost never get it back. So the old bamboozles tend to persist as the new ones rise. Finding the occasional straw of truth awash in a great ocean of confusion and bamboozle requires vigilance, dedication, and courage. But if we don't practice these tough habits of thought, we cannot hope to solve the truly serious problems that face us. And again, the money quote, we risk becoming a nation of suckers, a world of suckers, up for grabs by the next charlatan who saunters along. And if I could do like a mashup between Machiavelli and Sagan, which I never thought I'd ever do, like there's nothing in the world but charlatans in a certain sense. Some of you may have seen the film Malcolm X, and there's a little part where Malcolm is talking about the bamboozle. All right, this is the idea here. So when we're dealing with our side, when we're dealing with a democracy, we're dealing with something that Noam Chomsky is kind of well known for, this idea called manufacturing consent. If you live in an authoritarian country or a tyranny where there's a dictator, the dictator gets to do whatever the tyrant does what the tyrant wants to do. But if we live in a democracy, the people have to authorize it, at least nominally. And so it turns out that public opinion actually matters a lot in democracies. And therefore, people have developed really what you could call technologies mental technologies for manufacturing consent. And technologies for manufacturing consent is a fancy way of saying propaganda, or we're talking about big lies. There's a professor here at the University of Chicago in the political science department, John Mearsheimer, who I'm going to come back to again a little bit later, has a book from about 10 years ago called Why Leaders Lie. And he argues in that book that it's actually leaders in democratic countries who are more likely to lie to their own people than autocrats, right? It's not, he says best, he starts his book by saying that it's not surprising that Saddam Hussein did not lie about having weapons of mass destruction. He truthfully said he had none, but that George Bush and some of his key advisors did lie to the American people about the threat from Iraq. All right, so, and the money quote here at the very bottom is that it's easier for leaders to lie to their own people because there's usually a good deal of trust between them, right? There's this idea in the sense that, if you think, pick whoever the enemy du jour is, but if you think the Russians are our enemies, let's say, you're naturally going to be on your guard, suspicious, skeptical about anything you hear that's coming from that perspective or from that place. But if you're listening to something from our side, our government, our people, the chances are, for many people, you feel that these are our leaders, they're on our side, and therefore you can trust them, and that creates the opportunity to be lied to. And of course, we have lots of historical examples in the United States and history of this thing. Everybody here probably remember the Pentagon Papers, this whole idea that, it was a full-scale campaign of lying from the government to the public in order to manufacture consent for particular policies. Again, you may think the policies were good or the policies were bad, but the process by which it was done was through this kind of dissembling, let's call it. Or, for example, when we had the 2001 attacks on the United States, there was a very brief window in the first couple of weeks right after the attacks when there was a kind of attempt to try to understand why do they hate us so much to do this? Really, to kind of get our hands on what was going on in the minds of our adversaries. And but that thing shut down after a couple of weeks. And one of the strategies that came out of this, and it was articulated by Richard Pearl at the time, was this idea that terrorism must be decontextualized, right? And what he meant by saying it's decontextualized is that, well, let's do it the other way around. If you contextualize something, you put it in its context, you can see how it kind of makes sense from a particular perspective. It doesn't mean you're necessarily going to agree with it. Doesn't mean you're necessarily going to like it. It doesn't necessarily mean you think it's going to be true, but it means that you can comprehend it. When something is decontextualized, when it's stripped out of context, it necessarily cannot make any sense. It can only be that we were not attacked for any reason. We were only attacked because these people were evil, all right? And once these people are evil, then of course, certain kinds of responses are legitimated. If we come to the modern world, the contemporary world, Professor Mearsheimer, again, is making a similar kind of argument about today, for example, about the war in Ukraine. The standard narrative about what's going on in Ukraine is that it's an unjustified, unprovoked attack by the Russians, the evil Russians, the madman Putin on the innocent Ukrainians, and so on and so on. Mearsheimer's analysis, and I'm not here to say yay or nay right now, but I'm just present it to you, is 180 degrees the opposite. That if we try to see things in context, if we try to see things from the Russian perspective, it turns out actually the attack is not unprovoked, it's not unjustified, it's actually a response to a sequence of events that our side, the West, the United States, has precipitated. And if you're interested in finding out more about this, I mean, I'm not pushing his thing in particular, but he's got, I don't know, what is it, 28 million views now on this video about why Ukraine is the West's fault. And the video's from 7 years ago. I mean, you know, and he's got newer ones if you want to see them. But the idea here is that there's something going on our side. There's a big lie, or one possibility of looking at this, there's a big lie on our side that's shaping manufacturing consent. So for example, and we can start bringing this into some great books. Many of you no doubt familiar with 1984, read the novel, maybe seen the film. One of the strategies that Orwell depicts in the novel, and therefore is in the film, is this thing called the 2 minutes hate. And you get the population riled up about the enemy leader as the axis of evil. So I'll just show you a little clip here to give you a kind of sense of it.
Hey, Adam, if you're going to show clips, they weren't optimized for video, so they're not, nobody can hear them.
It's not going to work?
No, you have to, if you want to restart the share, you have to make sure you select optimize for streaming. Otherwise, the audience can't hear it.
They can't hear it?
Nope.
So what do I have to do?
Stop sharing. And then when you restart sharing, there's a choice at the bottom that says optimize for streaming video.
Like that?
Shout out his name.
Thanks.
All right, so one way of looking at these things is that, you know, we're living through something equivalent to this in the contemporary world, that, you know, where Orwell's Goldstein has been replaced by Putin. Another example comes out of a more recent film. Some of you may remember this thing called Wag the Dog, which really goes exactly to this idea of kind of our side propagating a big lie for political advantage.
There's a crisis in the White House.
What's the crisis?
And the president's top advisors have been called together.
Oh, jeez.
The sexual misconduct occurred inside the Oval Office. With the election only days away, how much will this scandal affect the outcome?
The president spent the weekend pressing the flash. He wasn't campaigning, he was dating, actually.
Now, Washington's top spin doctor
We can distract the press for 11 days till the election. I think we got a chance.
has an idea,
We can't afford a war.
We're gonna have the appearance of a war.
but he can't pull it off without Hollywood's top producer.
Do I know you?
We have some mutual friends in Washington.
Why come to me?
We want you to produce. You want me to produce your war? Not a war, it's a pageant. We need a theme, a song, some visuals. We need, you know, it's a pageant.
New Line Cinema presents
How close are you to this?
What do you want the kid to say?
all the spectacle,
I know we're all concerned for the president.
I know we're all concerned for the president.
I know that we are all concerned for the president.
He didn't sell the line.
all the drama,
The president's gonna go to war with Albania in about 30 minutes.
Albania's hard to run.
These are chips.
We need it for the armed position on the screen. It'll be a kitten. We'll punch it in later, right?
and all the effects of real war.
Okay, put the village behind her.
Give me some sound of screaming.
Without the casualties,
America has seldom witnessed a more poignant picture of
It's the same process with the last Schwarzenegger movie. You're the man.
Albania, Albania.
That rhymes.
I can't believe that we forgot a hero. It was like we sent him the Christmas card and we left out the what do you call?
Sergeant Schumann, if I may. Welcome to history.
How are you? Anybody want a beer? Because I could party.
When it's cooking, it's cooking.
From Academy Award-winning director Barry Levinson.
When this goes national, I get to put it on my resume?
Actually, no.
What could they do to me?
They come home to your house and kill you.
Academy Award winner Dustin Hoffman.
All right. So moving along here. So finally, just to bring this part of the presentation to an end, this idea of manufacturing consent, of having a big lie, now raises the question of whether or not, there are going to be things that we can or cannot say or be told here. And Walter Kern, who's a journalist, has a kind of a tweet that got me thinking about this. That says, if you analyze the news as a literary critic or as a drama critic would, it will all start to make sense. The scripts, the plots, the characters. Indeed, this is the only way to make sense of the news. Practice this approach long enough and you'll be guessing the endings. Well, of course, this in a certain sense was like music to my ears because we interpret text all the time, try to interpret stories. So this seemed like a possible idea. So the thing that happens here, I think, is that this big lie process, whether it's from them or our side, is that people then end up getting locked into particular ways of seeing things. And I've often found it helpful to use Gestalt images. You've probably seen some of these before, like the one on the left, the two faces in the vase. Maybe you've not seen the one in the middle or the one on the right before. But the idea here is that for many people, you can only see one of the images. Like you can see the vase, but not the two faces. Or in the middle one, whether you see the tree or you see the gorilla and the tiger or lion or whatever it is there. And there's a couple of fish jumping out of the water at the bottom. Or the one on the right, there's kind of a cartoony guy playing a saxophone or something, or the face of a woman. And thinking about things is often like this, that we get locked into one kind of paradigm, one kind of way of seeing things, and it becomes extremely difficult to see any other way. And of course, if somebody else is seeing the opposite picture, they're having the same problem in reverse. All right. So
Adam,
this
I think your screen share went off. Sorry.
It's not sharing? Are we having technical?
Okay, maybe it's back on. There it is. Okay.
Is that it?
Yeah, sorry.
Is that good?
Yep.
Okay. So if these are the problems or the issues that we're confronting, then how can we deal with this? What are the solutions that we can bring to this? How do we cultivate the ability to think critically so that we can see all the stories, see all the pictures, and be in a position to actually judge truth or falsity for our own selves? And this kind of brings me to the quote that I started with at the beginning, because I think this is one of the most perceptive things that I've seen in working with the basic program and the Great Books movement. That really, if we're going to be self-governing people, and we're going to be making decisions as individuals and as citizens, then we want to make good decisions, and that therefore requires that each of us becomes kind of like a philosopher. For those of you who have read Plato's Republic, you'll know, or if you've heard about Plato's Republic, you'll know that it makes a big deal about this thing called the philosopher-king, that if we can get political power and wisdom united in a single individual, then that will solve the world's problems, because the person will know what's supposed to be done and have the power to do it. we don't live in such a world, and therefore the world in which we live in a liberal democracy would require a citizenry of philosopher-citizens in order to be able to make wise decisions. And therefore, there's a responsibility on the part of education to help cultivate such people in order to make them good citizens. There's also the idea of making people self-actualized, all right? So I want to talk a little bit about a kind of famous book in the great books movement called The Great Conversation by Robert Hutchins, who was formerly a president of the University of Chicago and also a chancellor. And he says about liberal education and liberal artists that the liberal artist learns to read, write, speak, listen, understand, and think. And as we live in the tradition, whether we know it or not, so we are all liberal artists, whether we know it or not. We all practice the liberal arts well or badly, all the time, every day. As we should understand the tradition as well as we can in order to understand ourselves, so we should be as good liberal artists as we can in order to become as fully human as we can. So I take it that this conception that there's at least two advantages to pursuing lifelong liberal education. One is that we become better citizens, able to make wiser judgments. And the other is we become better human beings, more self-actualized in ourselves. Now, the reason Hutchins called this the Great Conversation was that he had this idea. I mean, he's not the only one that had this idea, but he articulated this idea, which is kind of the spirit behind the great books movement and the basic program, that the spirit of Western civilization is the spirit of inquiry. Its dominant element is the logos. Nothing is to remain undiscussed. No proposition is to be left unexamined. The exchange of ideas is held to be the path to the realization of the potentials of the human race. Right? So it's through this conversation, endless conversation, that we become smarter and self-actualized, both kind of as a species, as it were, as well as individuals. And he goes on and says that such a civilization presupposes communication, although it does not require agreement. The Great Conversation symbolizes the civilization of dialogue and promotes the realization of that civilization here and now, and that its object is to project this great conversation into the future and to have everybody participate in it. So it's not meant to be just the province of the privileged few, it's meant to be for everybody. A different professor here, Gerald Graff, back in the 90s, extended this idea in a book he called Beyond the Culture Wars, How Teaching the Conflicts Can Revitalize American Education. Graff's agenda at the time was dealing with wars over the Western canon, what students should be reading or not reading. And his position was that instead of taking sides, an educator really ought to teach the conflict itself so that students could appreciate both perspectives and form their own judgment. And so Graff said that when the truth is disputed, we can seek it only by entering the debate, as Socrates knew when he taught the conflicts 2 millennia ago. And even if there isn't any kind of debate in a kind of active contemporary sense, there's just a pure cognitive issue that's involved, which is that opposing texts and theories need one another to become intelligible to students. That in a certain sense, if you only read about one perspective, you can get something from it, but you're not going to understand it as deeply unless you can see it in the context of a variety of other perspectives. So this idea about critical thinking, learning not what to think, but how to think, is kind of at the heart of this enterprise called liberal education. And these are just a few quotes that have always kind of been near and dear to my heart. not least that thinking is the hardest work there is, which I suppose other people might quibble with. But I think the idea here is that we're really talking about, quality thinking is not simple. In part because, as Niels Bohr observed, it's often not just a choice between truth and falsity. Bohr said the opposite of a fact is a falsehood, but the opposite of one profound truth may very well be another profound truth. And when we're dealing with things in great books, for example, we can often have books that are expressing contradictory truths that might well, in some sense, both be true, which, is a difficult thing to work with. In fact, F. Scott Fitzgerald once said, the test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposing ideas in mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. And then the John Stuart Mill, this is kind of a well-known quote, but even if thinking was easy, even if we don't have contradictory opinions, the argument here is that he who knows only his own side of the case knows little of that. His reasons may be good, and no one may have been able to refute them, but if he is equally unable to refute the reasons on the opposite side, if he does not so much as know what they are, he has no ground for preferring either opinion. So even for our own good, according to Mill, we need to be in conversation with opposing perspectives. Which leads me back to a First Friday lecture I did a number of years ago, which has kind of always been near and dear to my heart, which is called Group Therapy with Great Books. And it was an opportunity for me to think a little bit more about what my understanding is of what we do in basic program classes, and how liberal education for adults is different than liberal education for primary or secondary school students, or for college students, for example. And the subtitle here was the point where I came down on this idea that I'm going to talk about for a few moments now, called the remaking of adults through lifelong liberal re-education. And the notion I derived from an old memo written by a former basic program instructor back in 1959. His name was Warren Winiarski. And he wrote a long memo reviewing the objectives of the basic program. And his core starting point was this observation that education for adults is education of those who are already educated. You've already been to primary, secondary, college, graduate, professional, wherever, you've already had an education. It is an attempt to educate those who have already been educated and are in some sense beyond education. Well, what are you going to do? What is an education program like the basic program going to do for people who are already educated? And Winiarski's conclusion is that the goal of the basic program was to remake adults. He says, we reopen universal problems and questions, and thus call into question the particular and specific answers which constitute the adultness of adults. We unmake adults. We make adults into children. Adult education of this kind is not a continuing of their education. It's the possibility of being re-educated. For to be educated in this way, insofar as the principles, answers, and beliefs constitutive of adultness are questioned, to be de-educated or to unlearn what we have learned before. It is in this sense, then, that liberal education for adults of the sort we have described is a danger to the adults we educate. So when I thought about this in the context of my understanding of what we do in the program, yes, there's a certain sense that we try to get back to basics and help people work their way out again and certain like that, and certainly start thinking about themselves or thinking about human beings as having different perspectives of what it can mean to be a human being. But this third one, this idea of removing barriers to understanding or blind spots, actually seemed to me to be kind of the unique contribution that something like the basic program can do. Because my experience has been that when people are working with great books, there's two basic sources of difficulty in comprehending the text. Sometimes the difficulty in comprehending the text is something in the text. The vocabulary is difficult. There's historical facts that we don't know about. There's obscure philosophical ideas that are difficult to grapple with. So sometimes the barriers to comprehension are in the text. But a lot of times the barriers to comprehension are actually in the readers. There's something that we bring to the reading experience that doesn't let us see what's in the text. It's kind of like those Gestalt images. We can only read the text coming at it from a particular perspective, and therefore that's not the perspective of the book, and that we just can't quite make that leap. And so this is where the idea of the group therapy came in, which is that fortunately most people have different blind spots than their neighbors, than other people in the class. And so one of the things that goes on collaboratively is that we kind of collaboratively help each other get over, work our way through the individual blind spots that we bring to this reading experience. And this idea was kind of put forward by another former basic program instructor and University of Chicago professor, Herman Sinaiko, in an article called Socrates and Freud, Talk and Truth, that I'm always pushing on people. And according to Sinaiko, he says the Socratic quest for self-knowledge is perhaps the single most difficult and problematic of all human endeavors. Probably the most difficult aspect of the enterprise is to understand that appearances to the contrary, we are not knowledgeable, but profoundly ignorant of ourselves. It is this profound ignorance of ourselves that was Socrates' greatest discovery. And so we told the next step, Sinaiko says that thinking of philosophy as kind of psyche therapy or therapy for the soul, Sinaiko says that in several of Plato's dialogues, Socrates likens his activity to the work of doctors. But whereas doctors treat the body, correcting its deficiencies and malfunctions, Socrates wishes to treat the soul and correct its disorders. For Socrates, the sickness of the soul was the essential ignorance from which we all suffer, ignorance of ourselves. And this then leads directly into Socrates' method. And many of you will have read Plato's Meno, and if you haven't, you should sign up for the basic program, or we'll read it together. But the essential structure of Socrates' method, as it's illustrated in the Meno, is kind of a three-step process. The first step is the unlearning of false opinions. 2, the arousal of true opinions. And for Socrates, opinions are different than knowledge. And so the third step then is taking those aroused true opinions and anchoring them by turning them into actual knowledge. And it's this step 1, unlearning of false opinions, that is the hardest step, and it is the most essential step, because you can't get on to step 2 or step 3 until step 1 is completed. And so finally with Sinaiko, he just observes that one of the things that makes Socrates, Socrates and Sigmund Freud, kind of 6 of one, half dozen of the other, is that they're both believers in the talking cure. This idea that by talking about things, thinking about things with other people, that we can transcend our ignorance. And Sinaiko says, one can learn without being taught. This possibility makes conversation, dialogue, the human activity most suited to the growth of wisdom in the soul. The greatest block to learning is our ignorance of our own ignorance. This block can be removed most effectively in a free, intimate conversation in which any participant can raise objections, demand clarification, or request further information. So how are we going to go about doing this? Well, plan A, obviously, if we could, is to have this conversation with Socrates. I mean, that's what Plato, this is the demonstration of all of Plato's dialogues, that if we can have this conversation with Socrates himself, we can have this talking cure for our ignorance about ourselves. But obviously Socrates is long gone, we can't do that. So we need a plan B. And the plan B is to read Socrates' equivalents, or little Socrateses, or whatever you want to call it, what Matthew Arnold once called the best which has been thought and said. And the idea is, by putting ourselves into conversation with these great books and these great ideas from a wide range of perspectives and periods, we can kind of simulate a little bit what it would be like to have a face-to-face conversation with Socrates. But it turns out that just simply reading these books by themselves is not the best plan. It's better if we can actually read these books and then discuss them with other people. Those other people might not be Socrates, but still, as this quote from William Matthews, which has always been kind of one of my favorites, even though it's a little bit archaic language, points out, he says, solitary reading will enable a man to stuff himself with information, but without conversation, his mind will become like a pond without an outlet, a mass of unhealthy stagnature. It is not enough to harvest knowledge by study. The wind of talk must winnow it and blow away the chaff. Then will the clear, bright grains of wisdom be garnered for our own use or that of others. But still, there's one step to make it even better, which is to read and discuss these great books with the help of professional educators. And this is where the infomercial part comes in. I'm not really doing it for that purpose, but for completeness, there really is the idea that there's some value that kind of like a catalyst to this process, that working with professional educators, you're not just reading and discussing with other people, but there's kind of an additional presence. And as Mark Van Doren pointed out, he says that the art of teaching, this kind of teaching, is the art of assisting discovery, so that students can have that same kind of Socratic experience as much as possible kind of in the modern world. So if I can kind of bring these things all back together now, the idea about great books and big lies, theirs and ours, is, as human beings, we live in a hostile intellectual environment. Apparently, it's always been the case. There's nothing special about 2022 in this respect. There's nothing special about a Democratic president or a Republican president or the Russians. Or, I mean, Machiavelli knew it, Socrates knew it. It's always been this way. And the antidote, the remedy, apparently has always been the same also. When I was growing up, these slogans were much more, or not much more, because they don't seem to be prominent today at all, but they were very prominent when I was growing up. A question authority, or especially, well, thank God, don't trust anybody over 30. That doesn't work so much for me anymore. But these ideas kind of at starting point. And when you start with this questioning, and questioning is at the heart of this great conversation, where everything is discussed, everything is questioned, we engage all of these ideas, and we look for evidence to support various perspectives. And this is the only chance, as far as I understand it, that we have to become this idea of philosopher-citizens on the one hand, or to become self-actualized on the other, and to kind of combat the big lies that populate our universe, no matter where they come from. All right, and so I'm going to stop there.
All righty, thank you, Adam. We have a number of questions. First of all, let me check the chat one last time. Okay, let me tell everybody in the audience that you can continue to type questions into chat, and I'll check them out. So let me get over to Microsoft Word here, Adam. Okay. The first question is from George Perez. When will Adam Rose offer another class on War and Peace?
I don't know, but if you send in a request to the powers that be, like Kendall, I'm sure they'll take it under advisement.
Thanks, George. Let's see. The next one is from Ben Yang, but let's see here. A question: should a democratic country initiate a movement to dismantle other autocratic / authoritarian regimes, assuming the democratic countries are still powerful enough to do it before it's too late? Oh, wait, and then it continues. The problem is, if democracy does not dismantle autocracy, the autocracy will be much likelier, I guess, to dismantle democracy, ?
So if I'm understanding the question properly, I mean, now it sounds like we're talking about a political question, and I wasn't so much trying to get into the issue of whether it was right or wrong for the United States to be supporting Ukraine, or obviously they're connected. The issue, though, that I'm trying to address is whether or not policy objectives, even potentially good policy objectives, are supported through what's called the big lie. I mean, there's the one thing about having policy debate where the debates are grounded in, facts, all these kinds of things. And there's a difference between where the real policy debate is obviated, sidetracked by propaganda. And I think, this question of, if you look at Professor Mearsheimer, and he's not the only one, by the way. I mean, they're a minority, to be sure, but I think they're an important minority in terms of another perspective about the conflict, if we're talking about Ukraine, that actually I think is being actively suppressed these days so that we can't have a discussion about it. So even if it's right, even if the policy turns out to be right, I think the process by which we have arrived at the policy was not right. And that's what I'm trying to address.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks, Ben. The next question comes from Ira Pilchin, who asks, or perhaps says, the 1959 objectives of the basic program, with its emphasis on re-education and turning adults into children, has disturbing implications in light of the cultural revolution, etc. So it's more of a statement than a question. So I'll add, n'est-ce pas? Does it not? I suppose.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, sure. I mean, the question of the very term in English, re-education, has all kinds of connotations around it. I mean, when I was growing, it's kind of re-education is like kissing cousin with like deprogramming, right? For like, people who were at Jonestown or whatever the case was. But I think this is it's an unavoidable issue. This is what education, whether it's re-education or just education is really about building, shaping human beings with the goal of making them better than they were before. It was like the $6 Million Man, if I can really go back into ancient history. And so the question of adult education, I mean, I'd have to give the full group therapy with great books lecture again to go into this. I don't know if that's available anywhere. Anyway, but the point is, there's a difference. There's just a technical difference, it seems to me, that Winiarski was pointing out. There's a technical difference in educating a 10-year-old or an 18-year-old or even a 28-year-old and educating a 60-year-old, let's say. And, usually, I mean, if you look at the title of the official name of the Graham School or other adult education schools, they're often called continuing education, like that the person is just continuing along whatever path they're already on. And in many cases, I suppose that's what that kind of adult education really is doing. Get your GED or whatever the case may be. But I think what we're engaged with in the basic program is really taking more or less fully formed, functioning, more or less, adults and still trying to make them even better than they were before. And I think this is where the Meno becomes particularly salient for us in the way that it might not be for a kindergarten class or even a high school class, that when you've lived so much life and you've had so much success and you already think you know everything. And probably you do know some things, but you probably don't know everything. That if you want to really grow further, the first step, it's almost like a 12-step program. It's like, hi, I'm 60 years old and I don't know everything. And that's a hard step for a lot of people to take, I think, but it's an essential step. And when we take that step, it opens the door to new possibilities. And I think that's the sense that Winiarski, you're talking about re-education or unmaking and remaking an adult.
All righty, let's see. Pardon me while I'm copying and pasting. The questions are coming in fast and thick. Let's see. Next one comes from Stephen Jevinson. I apologize if I'm pronouncing your G wrong. Stephen writes, Mearsheimer, in a talk in 2015 called "Why is Ukraine the West's Fault?" Said, quote, "There are many people saying Russia is going to go on a rampage. They're going to try and reestablish the Soviet Union or a greater Russia and so forth and so on. That's not going to happen. Putin is much too smart for that," close quote. For me, this wildly mistaken prediction from 7 years ago helps to contextualize the quality of Mearsheimer's ideas. Oh, and so it's more of a comment. I'll add, is it not? To turn it into a question for you.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think we're back to the same. If we want, again, we're back to the political content of Mearsheimer's point. I'm trying to come clean about this. I think if I'm understanding the question right, or the comment right, I think I'm in violent disagreement with it, because I think Mearsheimer is more right than he is wrong. But that's not my primary point in the basic program lecture. My primary point in this lecture is that I don't think we in this country are having a full-fledged debate about certain things, because, and it goes back to this, and it's not because it's necessarily Russia or Biden or whomever. Machiavelli pointed this out hundreds of years ago. This is not unique to us. This is, that the way things are done in the world a lot of the time is by a kind of political theater, if you want to call it. It's like the wag the dog thing, a kind of political theater, which is different than the kind of conversation. I think if we had a basic program class and you brought me one article by Mearsheimer and one article by somebody on the other side, and then we read them both and we tried to understand them in their own terms and assess the pros and cons, that would be quite a different intellectual event than what's happened in the public sphere over the last year in the United States, let's say.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks, Stephen, for your question. Next one comes from Ben Yang. I attempted to attract a few friend medical doctors to join my Plato reading. I did not succeed. They all live in luxury houses, go for expensive vacations far, far away, no interest in reading. Is there a cure for this disease?
Well, if you find it, I think you get a Nobel Prize. No, I think, look, that's really way over my pay grade. But it's the question that I think, Plato himself was dealing with this question. I mean, because one of, I don't know if you call it an irony, but obviously we know that Socrates was executed for his troubles, and Socrates himself was trying to do what you're talking about. How the question of why some people are interested in personal growth, or how some people discover an interest in personal growth, is really one of the miracle questions that I honestly don't know the answer to that. Sometimes it just seems some people are born with it and some people aren't, or sometimes people have some kind of life experience, some event. From many of the people in the basic program, a lot of times people retire and it's the first time in 30 or 40 years that they just had the mental space to sit back and reflect on things. And having that mental space to sit back and reflect may also be, just a kind of a practical ingredient. But I would say if you have any better thoughts on that, I would be certainly eager to hear them.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks, Ben. The next question comes from Stephen Locascio, who asks, can AI let us have conversations with Socrates?
Well, this is sounds like an advanced version of the Turing test or something. Honestly, I don't know. I mean, it's not like I have my finger on the pulse of contemporary artificial intelligence, so I can't tell you the technically true answer. I think Plan B, as I called it, what we do in the basic program with people who are honestly open to the process and honestly engaged in the process and honestly willing to be kind of vulnerable to the process in some sense, is not a bad Plan B at all. All right, especially since we get to read about Socrates. I mean, it's one of the most beautiful things that Plato has done for us and for the world is that, Socrates is dead, but he's been captured in these dialogues, right? That if I can reverse the familiar formula, with Plato has taken Socrates and made the flesh word. And so we can read that, and that's, I think, as close as we're going to get.
Thanks, Adam. Thank you, Stephen, for your question. The next one comes from Ray Lucchese. Ray asks, the problems with understanding contradicting opinions is that, one, it seems like you are being inundated with misinformation, falsehoods, and personalities which seem abhorrent. How does one hold one's nose to understand these conflicting opinions?
Well, it's a really great question, and it's almost the most important question, I think, the most important issue of this whole thing. As some people know, we basic program offers classes on how to read classic texts, and I often lead those classes. And in those classes we talk about what goes into good reading of great books. And one of the things that I talk about a lot in these classes is that from the perspective of that we're doing these things, is that the goal is to comprehend the book first and foremost. Comprehension is job one. And that means that the reading process ultimately, at least in it, or I shouldn't say ultimately, the reading process initially is not about us. So that we as readers have to really get over ourselves. And it means developing a kind of intellectual discipline to be able to read things that you may be violently opposed to, but still read them sympathetically, at least in the first reading, to try to understand, see what there might be there. Or conversely, if you're reading something that you're just extremely in love with, being able to have some critical distance from it to still push it to try to see what shortcomings or flaws might be in the thing that you appreciate. I did a class about a year ago, and we were reading, literally reading Mein Kampf along with Hannah Arendt. And for a lot of the students, obviously, it was quite difficult to read the Mein Kampf sympathetically. And I'm not saying you're supposed to agree with Hitler's conclusions about things, but you are supposed to try to, there's no point in reading it unless you're trying to figure out what the man has to say. And over the course of 10 weeks, people kept working at it. It was quite psychologically challenging. And I think a lot of people were kind of surprised that it turned out that Hitler, the author, was not a complete idiot, that he actually had a lot of insights into certain things. And that was almost maybe even more distressing than if Hitler had turned out to be a madman. But so I think that, this question then it's about developing an intellectual discipline and detachment. And it's not easy, but if you're open to developing that intellectual discipline and detachment, and you're working with other people who are likewise committed, it really does become like group therapy in a sense, is that we can all help each other maintain the intellectual discipline. And then when we comprehend things, then of course we can form judgments rationally on the basis of that.
Thank you, Adam. Let's see here. So we have time for a few more. And thank you, Ray. The next question is from one Joseph Alilis, and Joe asks, what do you think of the apparent reliance on big lies, namely myths, by Socrates in pursuit of political goals?
I think this would be a longer discussion, but I don't think Socrates, I haven't seen a case where Socrates is advocating big lies in exactly the sense that we're talking about it here. So I'm gonna punt on that.
All righty, Adam. Thank you very much. Thank you, Joe, for your question. The next one comes from Alex. How do you encourage people to be passionate about thinking without thinking too passionately? In other words, how do we avoid the passionate ideals and emotional pitfalls that create roadblocks to reasoning?
Well, it sounds like this question is a variant of the one that I was answering about this idea of intellectual discipline. And, I wish I had a magic answer, or I could put it in a bottle and sell it to you. Well, I can put it into a class and sell it to you, but I can't put it into a bottle. But the only answer I know, which may not be satisfactory, or maybe there's other people that know better than I do, is to have the desire to get there, and then the commitment to keep working at it. I mean, that's all there is. And all I can say is that I can't say that I'm the high priest of this or that I've perfected it, but I think I've gotten a fair amount of it, and it's taken a lifetime's amount of work. I mean, it's not easy, and truly, everybody has things. I mean, I'm not trying to say that everybody should become Mr. Spock or robot or become lose their passion for certain things. I'm quite passionate about many things, but still, you have to be able to compartmentalize these things temporarily, so that when we're in reading mode or analytical mode, we do that, and then when we're not, then we come out of it.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Alex, for your question. The next question comes from Margaret Go, who asks, why don't we teach children with the Socratic method from the beginning, or de-school children? Question mark.
Yeah, well, that's a good idea. There are some people who've had ideas like that. Mortimer Adler had something called the Paideia program, which may still be in operation. That's way out of my ballpark. I mean, I work with adults, I've worked with college students, but personally, I've never worked with people younger than college, so I'm not really qualified or comfortable to say something about what's appropriate for them.
Thanks, Adam. I have to add, Margaret, there's a child in the Meno who, undergoes. We just don't really know exactly how young he is. Next question is from Ray Lucchese. Ray asks, the great problem of the age is how technology has enabled the demise of humanity, or not prohibited a number of natural disasters, but humanity, civilization, political parties are only able to see the problems of today. I guess, how does how do philosopher-citizens / self-actualized humans try to engage on this problem and help solve them?
I lost the first part of it.
The great problem of the age is how technology has enabled the demise of humanity, or not prohibited a number of natural disasters, but humanity, civilization.
So if I'm understanding it correctly, I mean, I'm not sure why this particular problem is different than any other particular problem. I mean, each problem has its own particularities, but you know, I have to confess, I mean, I've drunk the Kool-Aid of the Enlightenment. Okay, I'm going to go to my deathbed believing in the power of reason. Maybe it's right, maybe it's wrong, but that's what I've signed up for. And it doesn't mean that it's guaranteed to work with everything, but I don't know of anything superior to reasoning. So whether it's environmental things, whether it's political things, whatever it is, I think this is the only, I mean, I don't think there's another tool in the toolkit other than sheer force, and that reason is superior to sheer force. And then if we're committed to using reason as an instrument to try to advance ourselves individually and collectively, then we apply it to everything.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks, Ray, for your question. And I think we have time for one more because we can run to 1:35 p.m. This one comes from Erasmo Passaro, and Erasmo asks, I agree that careful reading of the great books and interactive discussion can hone our critical thinking skills and open our minds to the truth. How does it teach us humility, that we may and are often wrong in our assumptions, have compassion for the quote enemy and not dehumanize them, ? Furthermore, how does it address our quote psychological baggage that helps us to more clearly discern the truth? In this regard, do you think the study of myths to study transcendent truths about human behavior is helpful?
So I think it, just say the beginning part one more time.
I agree that careful reading of the great books and interactive discussion can hone our critical thinking skills and open our minds to the truth, but how does it teach us humility?
Okay, right. So, so the humility part is the easiest part of the whole thing, right? As soon as you go into any of these readings or discussions or classes or something, and if you go in honestly, I mean, you can go in as a blowhard. I mean, we do have blowhards in the basic program, okay? But if you go in as a blowhard, it's a garbage in, garbage out. That's all you're going to get, all right? But if you go into the process openly, you're going to be humbled within 5 minutes by the book, by the colleagues, because we're dealing with great things, really. And no matter how smart each one of us may be, there's somebody who's thought something different or better. I mean, one of my favorite proverbs is an old ancient Greek proverb that says, wherever I go in my mind, there I meet Plato coming back. Okay. And it's just like, well, damn, that's right. So the humility part, I think, is not so much a problem. The harder part, I think, psychologically, is compassion for people who hold other positions. Well, I don't want to mean that in a belittling sense. I mean, one is respect for people who hold different positions from you, and also compassion for people who can't or won't or whatever get on board the critical thinking train. I mean, this is a human enterprise, and it's for the benefit of human beings. And it's not meant to be. I mean, it's adversarial in a technical sense that we're just debating things back and forth, but it's not adversarial in the sense of wanting to do harm to anybody. So I think that how we have compassion for people who disagree with us, or how we have compassion for people who have succumbed to one or another of the big lies, or how we have, it's a different challenge, but I think, I don't know anything else other than to keep working at it and to confess when you failed and apologize and get back up and try again.
Thank you very much, Adam. And now, everybody, I'm going to ask you all to unmute to observe our monthly custom of so that the speaker can hear your applause. So there goes the command to unmute yourself. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, everybody, for turning out.
Thank you, Adam.
Thank you, Adam.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful presentation. I loved it.
Great job.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great day. And the recording will show up on the YouTube channel next week.
Bye, Kendall.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Kendall.